Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll tackle a very nice topic, and this is versioning your ASP.NET Core APIs. And I think that when it comes to this aspect of versioning APIs in ASP.NET Core, there is a lot of uncertainty or a kind of lack of clarity about how we actually can version our ASP.NET Core APIs. And in this video, I really want to tackle like a baseline and to get the discussion going on different strategies or on different decisions that you might face when you really want to implement or need to implement versioning in your ASP.NET Core Web APIs. So the core concept here in this video is I really just want to go through all the options that we have at different stages when it comes to configuring versioning, but in the end, you will have to take your own decisions. What this video is here or is meant to do is bring some clarity about what actually the options are and what the pros and the cons for each of the options are when it comes to make a decision. So let's get right into it. Right, we have here a new Visual Studio project which is based on .NET 5. And we have here a very basic controller. Before we get going, let's run this application and let's just test this controller that everything's okay. So it's a very simple one. We just have here this GET request that we can make, and it returns us like a product. In this case, it has an ID, which is taken from the URL, and a name for the product, which in this case is VS 2022. And that's kind of like very cool. Now it comes to the point when we have to actually decide or to say we need to version this. So we might have this version 1 of this API that kind of like returns this result, but we might also want to have a version 2 of this endpoint that maybe would return here rider, which is another very cool idea when it comes to .NET development. So we have to really do that. And here's the first major part where we have to make a decision. And before we really get into coding it, I really want to discuss about that. Now, the idea is that when we implement versioning, there are two major approaches to that. The first approach would be to have actually different controllers. So we will have a products controller for version 1, and we will have a different products controller for version 2. So this is one approach that, in my opinion, is very straightforward. Now, the downside of it would be that some developers will say probably that if you go this approach, you will kind of like duplicate or repeat some code. So the do not repeat yourself principle would be kind of violated. However, I don't think that it is the case, because let's assume we have this products controller which has this method, and we would have another products controller that returns or that does logically maybe the exact same thing, but it just returns something else here in this name part. Now, if we think, okay, what does actually do not repeat yourself means? And here I really like to always think about it in terms of when do we actually need to change this class? What is the reason for change? And even if those methods in controller 1 or controller version 2 would actually seem kind of like a similar, the reason for change for them are totally different, because this controller would only change when we need to perform a change to the version 1, while changes to the other controller would need to happen only when we want to make a change to version 2. So they have two totally different reasons for change, and this is why I think that it's still okay. Now, the other approach would be to have only one controller here and really decorate or map each of the methods here or the controller actions to a certain API version. So we could say here, for instance, this one is mapped to version 1, but it's also mapped to version 2. And then we would have a different method, for instance, would be also maybe get by ID v2, and that would only map to v2, or this could only map to v1. Now, the idea or the plus side of this is that kind of like you have everything at the same place, but the downside of this approach is, from my point of view, that your controllers will get really clunky and messy when you add different versions and different endpoints that kind of like belong to the same version, but other endpoints that are mapped to only one version. So it will get kind of like confusing from my point of view. And that's why my preference goes actually for the approach where we have two dedicated controllers, or we have one dedicated controller for each version of this API. So in this video, this is also the route that we will take. Now let's set these things up a little bit. So in order to do that, we would have, or we would need here to create a new folder which call v1, and let's move this product controller into v1. So, and after we have moved it, let's also update the namespace, because we don't want to actually have a clash between these two different controllers. And the other thing that we could do, we can just copy this right now, and let's add another folder, and we'll call this folder here v2. So this will be the folder that will contain all our v2 controllers, so, or version 2. So let's add a new class here. We'll call this exactly the same, product controller, because it's exactly the same type of class, only that this one is actually dedicated for the v2 of our API, which we haven't implemented yet, but we'll do it in a very shortly. And here, instead of returning this VS2022, let's just return rider. So right now we have a v1 controller that returns here as a product name VS2022, and we have this controller for the version 2 that actually returns a different name here. So we will be able to actually also test this. Now, of course, if we would run this right now and actually try to make a request, we would have a problem, because we have actually two controllers for ASP.NET Core. They are kind of like the same controller and they have the same method, so they wouldn't exactly know how to pick that. Now, in order to test this, we also need to go to the next step, which is configuring API versioning in your ASP.NET Core project. So the first step was actually to really organize the projects for versioning. And for that step, we chose to have a v1 controller and a v2 controller for our product controller. Now, the second step, as said, it comes to configuring the versioning. Now, in order to do that, we need a NuGet package. So let's go here to manage NuGet packages. Let's go to browse. And the package that we actually need is Microsoft. Let's start here. Microsoft. Of course, I also have to type it correctly. It would be this one, Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC versioning. So this is the package that we would need to install. Let's accept this, and that should be installed in just 1 second, and we should be good to go. Now, of course, whenever we install a NuGet package, we usually also have to configure it. And the configuration is usually done here in the configure services, where we add different things to our DI container in ASP.NET Core. So we can simply do that. So it would be services, and this package that we have added contains this add API versioning that we could use. Now, this API versioning contains also, or we can actually provide here a configuration object, let's say config, where we can actually define exactly how we want to perform this configuration. So it's add API versioning. That should be actually be just fine. What the problem is, adds an API versioning, returns the services. Okay, what's the problem with this config? Oh, sorry, I just forgot. This is a Lambda expression. So we're good to go. Now I really want to spare a few minutes to really discuss some very important options. Once again, that I would assume or say they are kind of like a baseline for all the API versioning approaches. If you have some very specific requirements for your application, just look into this configuration object, what type of options you can configure. Once again, what we provide here is kind of like a baseline that would be useful for most of the projects where you would need to configure API versioning. Now, the first thing that I would like to do is say here config and provide a default API version. So this would be equal to a new API version. I don't want to have here this fully qualified name. So let's instead just remove that and just add here Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC, and that would be okay. Now, when we provide a new version, we can provide actually integers for the minor and for the major and the minor version. why this would be useful? Because, well, if there are some requests that come to this API and they don't provide versioning information, of course that they will get an exception back. And I kind of like don't think that this is a useful approach. Instead, is if some clients don't specify any version information that they would actually want to get, then we would assume a default version for them. And here we have set the default version, which is the 1.0. Of course, when we have a fully functional V2, we can say here the default version is 2.0 from that point on. But then the other config that comes actually paired with this default API version is this one that says assume default version when unspecified, and we set this to true. And this does exactly the same. If the client that makes the request doesn't specify a version information, we will simply assume that it wants to use the default version, which in our case will be v1. Now let's go for the next configuration. So the next one would be config. And here what I would like to do is also report API versions and also set this to true. Now what this will do is actually to each response that our API will generate, it will add a header in which it would specify the exact versions that this API supports. And this might be useful because clients have then this information there in each response, and they might implement some custom logic based on which supported versions we have. And this kind of like makes everything more transparent about what our API actually does and what versions it provides. And then there is one other very, very important option. And here we'll probably spend a little bit more time in discussing different options that we would have. And here this API version reader. So we have this API version reader, and here we have to instantiate this to something, which is of course a type of version reader. But before we instantiate that, let's go into another discussion here, and let's talk about the approaches that we have when it comes to getting or reading the API version from a request. Yes, so there are three main approaches. All of them are correct, but of course each of them comes with pros and with cons. That's why I was saying I just want to outline the options that we have. Neither of these options are wrong, but depending on your exact scenario, you might want to choose one or the other depending on the pros and the cons. Now, when it comes to reading versions, one very common approach, probably the most popular right now, at least in the .NET ecosystem, is to read that from the URL segment. So it would be something like API v1 products and then the ID. And this is the URL segment, and we would need to read the version from here. And as said, this is maybe one of the most popular approaches right now. Now, if we would like to implement that, then we would have to specify here a version reader that knows exactly how to read the version from this URL segment. In this case, we have this new URL segment version reader that we can create. And here, of course, we need to import the using. Probably I have specified here something wrong. So URL segment API version reader. Okay, it's like that. Okay, and now we have using Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC versioning. So once again, if we want to go this approach to read the API version from our URL segment, then of course we need this URL segment reader that knows exactly how to look for the version in our URL segment. And this is, as said, one of the most popular approaches. However, the downside of this approach is that it kind of like violates the REST principles, because if we really want to stick to the REST principles, that would mean that our URIs should only identify resources, nothing else. But in this case, we just have some parts in our URI that are actually not about the resource, but are about the API version. So this might be the downside. Now, if you want to be 100% REST compliant and you say, okay, this is not for me, I don't want to read this from the URL segment, Then there is another very popular approach. And once again, it's not that one is correct and the other is wrong. We just have three different options. In the end, we have to understand which are the pros and the cons for each of them, and then choose actually when we exactly know, or we can really make an informed decision, let's say. And then the other option would be to provide, or that the clients would provide versions in the header. And we would have in that case a header that would be called, for instance, API version, and it will contain a value maybe 1.0, for instance. So this would be the header. Now, if we would like to enforce this way of versioning and reading API versions from requests that comes to our API, instead of having this URL segment API version reader, we would have a new header API version reader. And that would be a version reader that it knows exactly how to read the version from the header. And that's quite okay. Of course, the good thing here is that our URIs won't actually have anything that corresponds to API versioning anymore. So they would be 100% only identifying resources. So that would be, of course, compliant with the REST principles. The downside to that is that, of course, clients will need to make sure that they would provide a version header to each request that they actually make. Okay, but if you say also, that's maybe also not for me, there's also another very popular way to do that. And this is, for instance, instead of having this in the header or in the URL segment, we have this information in the query string. So we would have here API version, and that would be maybe equals to, once again, 1.0 or 2.0. And if we want to go this route, then we would have to, or we would need here a query string API version reader, which, as the name implies for this class, is a version reader that knows exactly how to look for a version in the query string, and that should be okay. Now, these are the three possible approaches. As said, as I want in this video to really have a baseline for how things work, what are the pros and the cons for each approach, we will go step by step through all of this and see exactly in Postman how this relates to what we actually want to do. And let's start with what I perceive as being maybe the most popular right now, and that would be using the URL segment API version reader. So we are cool with that. We have chosen this reader. Now, according to this configuration that we have defined here, we might need to also tweak our endpoints. So let's go here to our endpoint and decorate this with API version. And here we say that as this is for version 1, here we have to provide a string here, and we say that it's of version 1.0. And then we have also to make some changes here in the route, because we need actually to provide a way for the URL segment API version reader to actually know exactly where to look and read the version from. So we would have here something like that, like V, but instead of having a hard-coded one, we just say here version, and we say here is API version. So it's actually like a placeholder where the version reader would actually look into and map the number that we might have here to a version of our API. And we should be good to go with that. Let's also delete this comment. We don't need it anymore. Let's go also to the V2 controller, and we need to do exactly the same thing. So in this case, we would have API version, but right now we would have here, this is version 2. And then here in the route, we would also have to say here a V, and then the placeholder where this version reader should pick into and look is, let's call it version, and it is of type. So this is actually a constraint. It should be actually bound to an API version. And this would be then version 2, which is really, really okay right now. And here we return a different thing. So right now we should actually be set up and everything should work. Now let's run the application and try to do some requests. Remember, right now we are doing everything, or we are using the URL segment version reader. So let's look into that. So we have this API version. Let's say we want the v1 in this case, and it returns VS 2022, which is correct. Now let's switch to the other. Let's say that we want the v2 of this endpoint, and you see that we have rider. So we have working API versioning in place where we provide, or where clients, consumers should provide the version that they actually want to get in the URL segment, which is a very, very popular approach. And it's, as you see, very, very simple to implement. Okay, let's go now to the next step and try this out and switch a little bit the configuration. And I would like to have or read the versions of the API from the header. So let's go back here on the startup class. And instead of providing this URL segment API version reader, we provide the header API version reader, only that here we would also have to specify the name of the header that we actually want to look into. So it would be API version. So in this case, we also have to tweak a little bit our controllers because we don't have this version information anymore in the controller itself. So let's remove that. And also let's remove that one. That would be okay, I guess. Now everything should be read from the header. So let's run this application again. And let's tweak a bit our requests. So right now we don't have any version information anymore in our API. So we remove it from there, but we have here a header, and we have this header, which is API version, and that's right now set to 2. So if we run this application, we see that we get the version 2 because the product name is rider. Now, if we change this to be v1, and if we run this, we see that it has changed, and right now we actually get this VS 2022. Right now, if we change this again to 2, then this is okay. And if we change this to 3, so this is a version that we actually don't have. And remember, we have set that configuration to default. Actually, we got here an error. But if we don't provide this header at all, we see that we get the default one. So if we don't provide a header that contains the API version, we just get the default, which we defined in the configuration as being this version 1. So this is how this works with reading the versions from the header. Now let's go once again and change things around and implement the third version, or the third options to actually read API versions. And this is from the query string. So let's have here, let's change this instead of header API version reader to query string API version reader. And that's exactly what we would need to do. Now in the controllers, we actually don't need to change anything because query strings are something that are added dynamically. So we really don't care about that. The only thing that we would care about is that if we run this application right now, if we go to Postman, now the API version header is nothing that would be really important for us. Instead, what we need to do is specify a query string, and we would have API version, and we can say here the version equals 2. And let's run this application, or let's run this request, and to see that we have this hello from rider. So it means that the version reader correctly picked up the version that we have specified in our query string. And for instance, let's use 1. And if we have the 1 version, we see that we get VS 2022. And if we don't specify anything as a query, our API, based on the configuration that would simply assume the default version if no version is specified. And still regarding our configurations that we have done, if we look here into our response headers, we see here this API supported versions header, and we see that we actually have here this version 1 and version 2. And as said, this versioning service simply adds to all responses a header that would contain actually all the versions that are currently supported by our API. So that's actually it for API versioning. You see that it's really not complicated at all. In the end, it's just installing a NuGet package and configuring the way that you want this versioning of your ASP.NET Core API to be. Now, in our case, we have made some choices when we have configured this add API versioning method. And here we have this default version that we have specified. We have this assume default version when unspecified set to true, and the most important thing, the API version reader. And here at this point, there's clearly a decision that you would have to make regarding on what exactly or how exactly do you want your clients, your consumers, to provide the version information. And based on that decision, you would have to actually choose the version reader that actually fits your needs. Once again, the options are you either specify these as part of the URL, and in this case, it would be an URL segment reader. You can specify as a custom header. In that case, it would be a header version API reader. And in this case, the last one, it would be a query string API version reader, exactly like the one that we have here. And that's basically it. That's how API versioning works. We have right now a working versioned ASP.NET Core API in which we have version 1 that returns something, and we have version 2 that actually returns a different thing. And we were able to see this based on the name of the product that we returned. And that's quite it. If you did enjoy this content, please hit the thumbs up button, and of course subscribe if you didn't do already, in order to be up to date to all the videos and live coding sessions that we do here on this Code Wrinkles channel. And if you think that you might have friends that also might find this video useful, don't be shy and feel free to spread the word, share this content across your social networks and wherever you might see fit, because people might really need it and find it useful. And if I don't ask too much, and if you have questions or just want to add something or get a discussion going, once again, don't be shy. And we have here this comment session. Just leave a comment. I would be more than glad to really get a discussion going here with you. But this being said, once again, thank you very much for watching. And until the next time, I wish you the very best.